In this video, I'm going to be sharing with you what I consider the 3 most important camera settings. Understanding these settings will do you a lot of good. I see a lot of people using these 3 settings improperly because they all affect your exposure. That's the brightness or the darkness of your image, and people tend to think that they can use them interchangeably, but they don't. As much as you can use this to create the brightness of an image or to bring the exposure down, they also have their side effects. And the 3 settings are your aperture, shutter speed, and your ISO. Let's dive right in. This video is not a deep dive into each of these settings, no. Getting an in-depth knowledge in each of those settings would require a full workshop. So what we're doing here is talking about them, telling you what they do and how you could use them. And it's your responsibility to go and gain in-depth knowledge. Number 1 is shutter speed. What's shutter speed? Shutter speed is simply how long light hits the camera sensor per second. So you hear 1/30th of a second, 1/50th, 100th. I'm sure you'd see the setting. Those functions actually control the exposure, really. You could make it bright, you could make it dark, but they also affect some other parts of the image, and that is the motion blur. When the figure is low, it sort of makes the picture image bright, but the adverse effect to that is that it blurs. It could blur a fast-moving image. The reverse is when it is very high. A slow-moving image could be jittery. When it's about, say, 1,000, 800, 1,000, 2,000, a slow-moving image could be jittery. So what is the basic or the normal shutter speed for a 24 frames per second, the normal motion? Ideally, it's within the range of 50 to maybe 100, 125. But if you're taking fast cars, maybe cars that are passing very quickly on the road, you don't want to do 30, you don't even want to do 50. You want to crank it up to like 400, 800, so that it's able to grab fast-moving vehicles. You don't just use them because you want to gain exposure for that sake. You need to also understand the context, what you're filming. The second one is called aperture, or you can call it iris, whichever one. An aperture is responsible for controlling how much light gets into the camera. In a layman's term, controls the brightness or the darkness of the camera. That is its major work. So the difference between a shutter speed and an aperture is shutter speed controls how long light gets into the camera. Aperture controls how much light gets into the camera. You see the difference? So aperture is basically for exposure. And it's kind of confusing because the lower the number, the brighter the image. The higher the number, the darker the image. And you sort of see it from the lens, how it opens. It works like the human eye. But the other effects to it is when you increase the when you reduce the number, which makes it very bright, it gives you a thin depth of field. What is depth of field? The area of acceptable sharpness. So when you increase the number too much, you would have blurred background. Only your subject or whatever you're focusing on would be in focus. But the danger to that is it could easily go out of focus. So you're not using that. I see a lot of filmmakers, a lot of DPs, cinematographers do this. Background will be very blurry. When the person moves a bit, it goes out of focus and it makes your job crappy. Like, I've never done that before. I have never done that before. Only once. There are certain kind of shots you want to take, like landscape, maybe a wide shot of an environment that needs every detail to be sharp, nothing blurred. You do it and you see some parts blurred and some parts sharp. So, they are not, you don't just use them because you feel like. The third one is ISO. ISO is the image sensitivity to light. It also controls the exposure. You could use it to make the image brighter or darker. And ISO is pretty straightforward because The lower the number, the darker the image. The higher the number, the brighter the image. But there's also an effect to that. You don't just crank it up whichever way you please. No. Every camera have their native ISO. Okay, so whatever camera you're using, you need to make your research to know what their native ISO is, because the higher the ISO, the more noise or grain you're getting in your image. The lower the ISO, the less. So we'd advise for a DSLR camera, for instance, not to go beyond 800. 800 would start giving you some amount of noise, but not very visible. If stay within 100 to 400, if possible. Don't go beyond that. But if you're in a low light situation, then you could crank it up to 800. But if you do 1000, then you will see visible noise on your camera, on your image. So that's basically how ISO work. So you don't just say, okay, let me move my ISO to 2000 because the option is there. No, you're going to mess your image up. It's going to look very, very terrible. Sometimes, yeah, if I'm in a low light situation, I do not have an option. Then I would crank up my ISO to maybe 1000, 1600 max. Knowing that in post, I would clean the noise up. When you are in some tight situations that, no solution at that moment, there's nothing you could do, then you probably need to crank it up. You still do not even crank it beyond a certain level. It would have some amount of grain that can be repaired, that is repairable. There are some grains you would have in your image. Nah. There would be no solutions to that. So you'd also have to be very, very careful. So you would understand that each of these camera settings are responsible for image exposure. But when they are not used properly, they can mess your job up. They can mess your image up. Those are not the only settings in cameras. But if you have an in-depth knowledge of these three, then you are good to go. I think I'm done. Am I done? I hope you got some value out of this video. So comment below if you learned something. If you need any clarification, also comment. If you haven't subscribed already to my YouTube channel, please press that bell below so that you would get updates on our videos. All right? I'm tired of speaking. That's all for today. Let me go and eat. I've been very, very hungry. Bye.